The razor was older than it should have been, a dull chrome relic pulled from a drawer that stuck in winter. Michael Walker held it like a question he could not stop asking. The bathroom mirror poured down an unkind light. The fixture hummed a thin electric thread, needling the silence. Beneath the knit cap, the familiar pressure weighted ridges and swells, a landscape he mapped by touch and refused to chart. He lifted the razor. The air cooled around the blade. His hand trembled not from age, but from the long ache of being seen. He pictured a neat incision, an obedient surrender of skin, the first small proof that he still commanded the country of his own body. He imagined quiet without the weight that had lived above his skull for decades. Then a sound rose through the floorboards, laughter light and unafraid. The quick percussion of small feet on the stairs, the bright scatter of a morning he had not invited. The blade hovered at his temple. He set it in the sink. Porcelain answered with a soft click as if the room had exhaled for him. He drew the cap tight and let his breath climb back in careful rungs. Morning opened the house. Beyond the windows, the Pacific lifted its slow shoulders, gray and huge, as though the horizon were breathing under a wool blanket. Seaside Oregon spoke in winter tones, a salt-stained pickup grumbling down Broadway gulls, stitching the sky with impatient wings, the carousel in the old pavilion sleeping until noon. Mike, no one called him Michael unless a form insisted, took the stairs one at a time, knees murmuring like old boards. The kitchen kept yesterday's coffee and the afterimage of warmth. Sunlight arrived thin, but it arrived. The car door thudded. The front latch protested. Emily's voice entered first the way spring enters a room when someone opens a window. She moved with the crisp clatter of a working mother canvas tote on her shoulder, thermos in one hand, the day already braided in her head. The children followed, heat and motion distilled into small bodies. Lucas wore rubber boots and a cape cut from a pillowcase convinced wind belonged to him. Grace hovered by the table, careful with a book whose purple spine had traveled in her backpack so long it knew the shape of her shoulder. Ethan, dark-eyed and watchful, kept close to his sister's gravity. Mike's heart knew how to lift and hide at once. The brim of his cap was a trained habit, the angle of his face a learned geography. He had rehearsed the choreography of avoidance until it felt like muscle memory, a turn toward shadow, a sideways hug that transformed a head into a shoulder, the small joke that guided attention elsewhere. He moved through them like weather noticed but not held. Emily's smile met him halfway. It carried Sarah's patience, a gentleness that untied knots without announcing victory. They cooked without instruction. Pancakes bronzed on the old cast iron. Bacon sighed in a pan that had outlived 3 presidents. The room took on the humming warmth of a place that remembers how to be alive. The radio on the sill sent a low country song across the sink dobro memory, the kind of a chorus that knew every kitchen where morning had ever been remade. Conversation happened around him like rain around a roof. In the rain, there was one bright drop. Lucas, who believed questions were doors you opened simply by knocking, looked up with open curiosity and asked why his grandfather wore the cap even when the day was warm. The room did not freeze. It bowed, as if a wave had passed beneath the floor and lifted everything half an inch before setting it down again. Mike reached for a plate he did not need and offered to the air the old explanation about drafts and habit and how certain heads stayed cold even in July. Lucas accepted it the way boys accept modest myths when love asks them to, but the question stayed. It took a chair and ate with them. It followed the syrup. It stood by the sink while Emily washed and hummed the tune Sarah used to hum when a room dared to feel too quiet. After backpacks were shouldered and the car reversed down the drive, Seaside resumed its winter pace. Mike stepped outside for the mail and back again without lifting his eyes. The cap carried the ocean's damp like private weather. On the mantel, photographs watched him with their practiced hush, Sarah holding a paper cup of fairground lemonade. Emily, at 10, with scabbed knees and the kind of smile that forgives a long day. Himself, on a motorcycle pressed into the past so firmly, the image no longer felt like a mirror, only a rumor. He had kept the garage sign in the barn, the red letters Walker's Auto thinned by salt air until they looked like letters trying to remember themselves. Once the shop had been a hinge, the town swung on. Once engines answered to his hands and Friday nights to his laugh. He allowed the past to arrive in the small, bearable rations, the summer track at Tillamook, the Yamaha's throat opening as if the machine had been waiting to breathe. Sarah, in a red bandana, fearless as weather, holding a thumb-sized camera whose pictures always leaned left. Their first apartment above the shop, a mattress on the floor, a calendar nailed, crooked, the future spilling from a box labeled Someday. Then, the first pebble beneath his hairline, a doctor with a clean coat and a warm certainty. A second pebble, a third, scars where answers should have lived. Years learned a different medicine, a cap that did not come off a calendar that stopped asking for photographs, a mirror polished without being used. Seaside learned, too. People are generous when they can be curious when they cannot help it, and busy either way. Invitations thinned. The doorbell forgot his address. He became a roomer with a lawn and the kind of mail that comes addressed to current resident. Emily kept returning with patients disguised as errands. She stacked groceries where he would not forget them and slipped a small plant onto the windowsill because the house seemed to be holding its breath. She replaced cracked mugs with new ones that made coffee taste like coffee again. He wanted to tell her that love sometimes made him heavier, not lighter. He wanted to tell her he remembered the night she was born as if the whole world had briefly rested in his arms, that he could still hear Sarah laughing at his clumsy attempt to swaddle, that his fear had not been born monstrous, only patient. Afternoon leaned against the glass. The ocean shouldered the horizon, steady as breath. Mike stood at the sink and let the tap run until cold felt like a language he could understand. In the bathroom, the razor waited where he had left it, not a verdict, only a thought. A cliff he could approach and step back from without anyone knowing he had seen the edge. He touched the brim of his cap and let his hand fall. Somewhere, a gull cried with comic outrage as if a joke had been told at the expense of the sea. If stories like this keep you company in the long drift of the day, subscribe so the next one can find you when you need it most. By midweek, the ocean had learned a harsher syllable. The wind came hard off the Pacific, combing the dunes and lifting grit into the air until the town felt sanded down to its grain. Mike moved through the house as if careful not to wake something. He rinsed a mug he did not use, wiped a counter already clean, stood in the threshold of the garage and let his eyes rest on the bicycle he kept oiled for no one. The knit cap rode low, obedient as weather. Emily arrived with the late morning light and a carton of eggs balanced on a book she'd borrowed from the school library. Her presence rearranged the room without asking. Curtains nudged open a window, unlatched 2 fingers for air. The old radio coaxed into a soft murmur. She moved with the tempered certainty of a woman who had learned all the different ways a day could wobble. Mike felt himself make smaller shapes so she would not have to step around him. They tried a peaceful choreography. She put the kettle on. He set 2 mugs. Neither spoke of the razor waiting in the bathroom like an interrupted sentence. He could feel her looking at him the way you look at a photograph you have seen too often, trying to notice what you missed, dreading that nothing has changed. When words finally came, they took the form of care offered as logistics appointments she could drive him to if he ever wanted a flyer she had found folded into a square inside her pocket, the name of a doctor she had underlined twice. He watched the steam rise from her mug and understood that steam was water wishing to be light. He did not say no. He assembled the familiar fortress of mild deflection, the weather the garage sign he might finally take down the way gulls had gotten braver about stealing fries on the promenade. She listened as if each sentence were a rope he might be climbing back toward her. The cap stayed on. The room found its equilibrium a fragile domestic truce. The truce did not hold outside. They walked to the weekly market because routine is a language families can still speak when they have forgotten how to sing. Seaside gathered beneath strings of tinny flags and a sky so pale it seemed to apologize. Stalls offered jars of honey lined like gold bricks, spools of twine that smelled faintly of barns, apples dull with winter but honest. Children tugged at sleeves. A busker tuned a guitar that had already given the day everything it had. Mike kept to the edges, learning once again how to be background. He read labels he could recite, let vendors greet him with the careful cheer reserved for men who might leave early. Emily was warmth in motion, smiling across counters, making change with a schoolteacher's patience, keeping a quiet orbit around her father, the way a lighthouse keeps its promise without drama. The wind arrived like a thought no one wanted to think. It reached under the cap and lifted. For a second, the knit held to him as if remembering its one job. Then it let go. The cap rolled a small gray animal startled into flight. He saw the nearest faces change the way faces do when something private becomes public without consent, eyes enlarging as if vision itself were a kind of trespass. A child's voice, too clean to be cruel, cut through the market's noise. There were phones and hands quick as reflex lenses blinking open like mechanical eyes that do not know they are unkind. Mike's scalp met the open air. He did not touch it. He did not negotiate with dignity or shape a smile as alibi. He felt the cold on the places where skin had learned to be thin and knew there would be a moment later when the sensation would return as memory and sting 10 times harder. For now, the body took over. He moved. He moved the way a man moves when the water is colder than expected, and the shore is a promise he can see. The crowd parted in the particular way crowds part for shame or sirens. Somewhere behind him, Emily said his name, not loud, not pleading, simply giving him the gift of being called to. He did not stop until the market's flags had nothing to say to him. An alley received him. He leaned against the brick with both palms and listened to the building hum. The cap, retrieved by a pair of hands he did not look at, was returned. The hands might have been kind. He replaced the knit with the care of a man bandaging something he cannot fix. When he finally met Emily's eyes, he saw anger braided with love, fear braided with a lifetime of small forgivenesses. She did not ask if he was all right. The question would have broken on the obvious. Instead, she stood in the wind with him until the wind believed them. Back at the house, quiet took up residence like weather that has decided to stay. He sat at the table and traced the seam in the wood with his thumb, a pilgrimage from one edge to the other. Emily cleared the sink with a patience that was not surrender. The air between them carried a sentence neither wanted to finish. It said that there are kinds of exposure that bleach more than they reveal, that sometimes the camera obscures and the gaze devours. It said that a man cannot live long under a shadow without becoming its shape. Evening dimmed the coastline until town lights seemed like small boats thinking about harbor. Emily left with a hug so careful it felt like placing a bowl on a high shelf, one last look in his direction, but not the kind that demands. He watched her taillights reverse down the familiar gravel, felt the driveway return to itself. Night is honest. It tells the truth that daylight edits. In that honesty, the house grew narrow. The bathroom mirror found him as mirrors do when you go to look for water and find yourself instead. The razor waited in its shallow dish. Under the cap, his scalp felt fevered, not with illness but with a tension he could not escape. He thought of the market of the child's clear voice of pixels lighting up in pockets as if each square inch of him were data to be owned. He said a sentence aloud, not to the room, not to Sarah, not even to himself. It was a string of plain words, the kind men speak when no one is there to interrupt them with comfort. It amounted to this, that control might be a small mercy worth taking back by any means that did not involve strangers keeping score. He removed the cap. The air hit bare skin and made a sound only he could hear. He picked up the razor and balanced it between 2 fingers, the way he used to balance a wrench across his knuckles, testing weight, learning the promise of a tool. The steel did not gleam. It remembered bathrooms older than this one and winters that had outlasted love. He placed the flat of the blade just behind his left ear and pressed until sensation arrived, not pain, not yet only the light insistence of decision. His breath climbed and stalled like a truck on a hill that had always been steeper than it looked. On the stair outside the bathroom, a board spoke. Another spoke lower, closer, the language of someone who knows a house by heart and has chosen to step softly anyway. He did not move the blade. The doorframe received a shadow, and then a figure. Emily filled the threshold with the steadiness she had learned from lifting sleeping children into beds without waking them. In her face there was no shock to injure him, only the collected grief of years spent inventing less dangerous explanations. No one said the obvious. She crossed the tile and reached out the way one reaches for a kettle about to boil over, not with fear, with timing. The razor came away. It made a small sound in the sink, more embarrassed than metallic. She stayed beside him until the breath he had been borrowing from courage returned from wherever it had gone to hide. When she finally spoke, it was to suggest water and then tea, and then a chair near a window that could be opened if the room had begun to feel tight again. The night did not become gentle. It became possible. The cap returned to his head not as armor, but as a pause. On the kitchen table, she placed a new rectangle of paper unfolded with care, its edges softened by how long she had carried it. A name was written there, an address that belonged to another city, the promise of a waiting room where no one would look at him as if he were a story first and a person second. Outside, the ocean kept breathing. Inside, a plan no larger than a match struck in a dark room learned its first small flame. If you find yourself holding your breath and need a hand to hold it with you, subscribe, so the next chapter of this journey reaches you when it matters. The decision did not arrive as thunder. It arrived like a tide changing its mind, quiet, incremental, impossible to argue with once you noticed how far the water had come. Mike woke before first light and packed without the theater of farewell. A shirt that had kept its courage. The flannel he wore when work still meant lifting engines with his back and not memories with his chest. A thermos Emily had rinsed until it forgot every old taste. He folded everything with the slow precision of a man repairing a small thing because the large thing would not yet be repaired. Outside Seaside practiced its gray. The street lamps thought about sleep. The surf rehearsed its single patient sentence. Emily stood by the car with her hands in her coat pockets as if she were holding two warm stones. They did not trade speeches. She drove. The cap sat where it always sat, brim, low, and honest about its intentions. They passed the diners that still remembered Sarah's order and the high school field where weekends smelled like wet grass and hot dogs. Emily's wipers counted time across the windshield. Neither of them asked whether he was ready. Readiness had nothing to do with it. You leave when the leaving becomes part of breathing. At the Amtrak station in Portland, the platform wore the particular tiredness of places designed for waiting. A train huffed like an old horse. Emily walked beside him until there was no more beside to be than let her voice be small and steady in the cold air. He heard what he needed to hear, the promise that her belief would hold even when his failed. He carried that promise like a second heartbeat into the car with its thin carpeting and the clean smell of someone else's morning. The ride east was a collage of rivers and backs of towns. The Columbia unrolled in its winter colors, a long, muscular gray shouldered by hills that kept their counsel. Farmhouses learned to be brief in the distance. In the glass beside his face, Mike's reflection sat at a slant, the cap a familiar roof. He thought of the old garage sign sleeping in the barn of Friday nights when the radio had praised his hands of Sarah's red bandana and the way she tied it like a flag at the top of a day. He let the pictures come without arguing who they belonged to now. By the time he reached the airport, the day had learned to glow in the unfamiliar way terminals glow fluorescent unweathered by weather. He moved from line to line with the obedience of a traveler who has given the day permission to boss him around. The plane taxied and lifted. Oregon fell away stitched to itself by rivers and roads, then refused to be anything but cloud. In the pressurized hush, Mike found a pocket of sleep that felt like standing at the edge of it rather than falling in. When he woke to the little theater of landing, the practiced patter of flight attendants, the shiver of wheels meeting a new city. New York presented itself the way a story does when someone starts talking fast. The taxi took him through an atlas of rectangles, glass that believed in its own brightness, billboards with faces too large to know, a courier on a bicycle braiding through danger with an ease that felt like youth. Mike watched and remembered that cities have their own weather made of ambition and steam. The clinic did not look heroic. It looked like any good building looks when it means to be used, clean, unpretentious a place for work rather than miracles. Inside the waiting room, practiced kindness without turning it into performance. chairs that respected the geometry of a body, a potted plant too healthy to be fake and too neat to be ignored, a magazine whose cover promised a life made orderly by bullet points. The receptionist said his name with the unremarkable assurance of someone who has said many names today and will say many more tomorrow. Mike felt the cap sit on his head like a thought he hadn't finished thinking. When the door opened, the physician who entered brought with her a quiet width to the room. Dr. Emma Carter was not what television would have hired. She was better a person first with attention like a well-lit table. She shook his hand the way you listen with your palm. She did not rush the air. She sat and gave him the gift of time, measured not by billing, but by breath. He noticed her shoes were the kind that forgive long days. He noticed the way she aimed her questions at the human behind the data. The story he had told no one in a single unbroken line came out in careful segments as if he were unspooling wire and checking for kinks. Years condensed into weather. Surgeries that had been answers until they weren't. A marriage that still held shape inside his chest even though grief had learned all the rooms of his house. He did not embellish. He did not apologize. When he paused, she let the silence be a chair he could use, not a trap he had fallen into. There came the moment he had been both walking toward and away from. It announced itself with nothing more dramatic than his own hands at the base of the cap. He lifted the knit slowly, a man opening a door he has barred for reasons that once felt like survival and now feel like habit. The air touched him. He did not look for her reaction. He waited to hear it in the quality of the room. Nothing sharp arrived. Dr. Carter moved closer with the steadiness of someone who has practiced steadiness until it became reflex. Her eyes did their good work. Her hands gloved and careful mapped without trespassing. She asked whether pressing here hurt, whether this edge had changed, whether a scar he had stopped remembering had a story he wanted to tell. In her face there was regard, not pity, craft, not curiosity. The exam was not a spectacle. It was a conversation in the language of touch and observation. When she spoke, her words carried plainness the way a good bridge carries weight. What he had, she said, had a name, Brooke-Spiegler syndrome. The syllables were strangers now, but would learn how to sit in his mouth. It was a rare genetic condition that asked certain cells to grow the wrong kind of bravely making benign tumors. Cylindromas, spiratinomas, trichoepitheliomas, most often on the scalp and face. Not contagious, usually not cancer, a nuisance that could become a life, and a life that did not have to be all nuisance. Treatment would be practical. Remove the ones that hurt, the ones that interfered with living. Watch the others. Work in stages. Let healing have time. There was talk of genetic testing not as a verdict but as knowledge, a way to put light in a room that fear had been using for storage. Mike felt something in his chest release the way a knot releases when the right hand finds the right angle. He did not mistake naming for saving, but names turn a blur into a thing you can meet in daylight. A plan sketched itself between the photographs taken with his consent scans, scheduled at hours that respected a person's need to be a person, the first procedure booked in a block of morning that would allow afternoon to be ordinary again if it wanted. He left the room lighter in a way no scale could register. On the sidewalk, New York performed its relentless competence sirens, arguing with traffic steam rising from a street like a spirit that refused to be the moral of any story. He stood still and let the city be the city. In his pocket, the appointment card pressed its small rectangle against his palm, proof that the future could fit in a wallet. Back in the hotel, he set the cap on the dresser instead of wearing it to sleep. He did not frame the gesture with courage. He let it be practical, like taking off your boots so the carpet can forgive you. He lay on the bed and listened to pipes speaking a language made of floors and pressure. He thought of Emily's hands in her coat pockets, two warm stones. He thought of Ethan's serious eyes and the way a boy watches a man for the trick he will spend a lifetime learning how to stay. In the dark, he understood that this was not a story about becoming who he had been. It was about becoming who he could be with what remained. The match, struck in a small room, had learned to be a pilot. Light, steady, quiet, hard to see unless you needed it. He closed his eyes and let sleep arrive the way trains do when the tracks are clear. Not early, not late exactly when they can. The envelope lay on the hotel desk like it knew too much. Mike hadn't opened it yet. He had only turned it over in his hands the way a man might weigh a stone before throwing it into water. The clinic had promised quick results on the genetic test for Ethan. Quick meaning less than a week. It felt heavier than paper should feel, heavier than anything that didn't have blood in it. The window looked east toward a skyline unwilling to apologize for being itself. New York rose in bright blocks, a geometry of ambition too large for anyone's grief to matter. Mike stood in the hotel room with its soft carpet and its well-lit silence, and he didn't move to the window because there are times you don't need the whole world watching. When he finally tore the seal, the letter spoke without ceremony. Clinical phrases, words that didn't raise their voice, probable hereditary component. Elevated risk. Recommend monitoring. He read it twice before he let the paper rest on the desk like a tired messenger. Ethan's face came to him, those serious eyes that looked like they'd been borrowed from a man who hadn't lived yet but already knew too much. Mike sat down hard in the chair by the bed. He felt the old house back in Seaside pressing through memory, the smell of salt and coffee, the small shoes left by the door. He saw the boy in the yard trying to make a kite rise in wind that wouldn't cooperate. He thought of his own father, a man whose shoulders had been mountains until the day Mike realized they were only bones like anyone else's. Legacy was supposed to be lessons and tools, maybe a garage full of wrenches someone could still use. Not this. Not a map of scars written under the skin passed along like an heirloom no one wanted. The phone rang once on the table, and then again when he didn't answer. Emily's voice lived inside the machine, leaving words he didn't play. He imagined her standing in her kitchen 3 time zones away, the paper in her hands shaking the way his hadn't, because fathers learn young how to hold still when the ground moves. He left the hotel before evening came. The city tried to keep him, but Mike had already packed the single bag that held his entire traveling life. At Penn Station, he bought a ticket west without caring which train carried it. He boarded, when called, sat by a window where reflection and darkness fought for space, and watched New York peel away behind him like a page he hadn't finished but couldn't keep reading. Through the night, the country unrolled itself. Towns blinked by anonymous except for the lights they wore. In the glass, he saw his own face layered over everything rushing backward. The cap stayed on its fabric, smelling faintly of wind and time. He thought about the first lump decades ago, the doctors who spoke in percentages the way Sarah had tried to make her voice calm when she asked what the surgeon said. He thought about Ethan again, and felt the shame come like weather cold and full of corners. By the time Seaside found him, morning had taken the sky apart and put it back together in gray pieces. The ocean smelled like it always had, ancient, unimpressed by human crisis. The house waited with its familiar creaks, the mail on the table exactly where it would be if the world had not shifted at all. Mike closed the door behind him and felt the walls take back the shape of his absence. Emily arrived before noon, headlights sweeping the drive like searchlights. She didn't knock, just came in carrying the kind of quiet that meant news. He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it standing by the window, her shoulders folding inward 1 inch at a time. When she turned, her face carried more than anger. It held the kind of exhaustion that comes from loving people who insist on vanishing when you need them most. She asked him if he understood what this meant for Ethan, for her, for everyone who had watched him disappear into himself all these years. He didn't answer because answers have to be better than silence, or they aren't worth speaking. Emily kept going, words breaking their own speed limit now. About the birthdays he had missed by standing in corners, about the photographs without his face in them, about the boy who might now inherit more than his jawline. The house seemed smaller, with every sentence the walls leaning in to hear the verdict. Mike listened the way trees listen to wind, shaken but rooted. He wanted to tell her he hadn't chosen any of this, that shame builds its own rooms and locks the doors from the inside. He wanted to explain how living under a hat for half a life makes you forget what sunlight feels like on the unhidden parts. But explanations are only words, and she already had too many of those. When Emily finally stopped, the air between them felt bruised. He said he was sorry, and it sounded thin even to him. She asked him not to be sorry, but to be present to do something other than vanish when things got sharp. Her voice cracked only once on the word father, as if the word itself had cut her. That night, he lay awake in the house that had outlived Sarah and too many versions of himself. He thought about the clinic back east, the plan sketched in a doctor's careful handwriting, the first surgery, waiting like a door he hadn't opened. He thought about the look on Emily's face when she read the letter about Ethan standing very still the way children do when they sense adults breaking behind them. By morning, Mike had decided, though decide is the wrong word for what happens when a man simply runs out of places to hide. He packed again the same shirt and the same thermos, the same single bag, and left a note on the table because some words are better on paper where they can't hear themselves out loud. At the station, the train arrived breathing diesel and distance. Mike boarded without looking back at the house. The yard, the garage whose tools had hung on their pegs so long they might as well have been part of the wall. He sat by the window and watched Seaside slide away the ocean, throwing itself at the shore like it always had, like it always would, whether anyone was there to see it or not. Somewhere past the mountains, he felt the decision settle in his bones to return to New York to the clinic to Dr. Carter, with her steady hands and her way of speaking that made medical words feel almost human. To the first surgery that would take pieces of him he was ready to lose. To the possibility that what had been passed down might be met with something other than silence this time. The train leaned into its long curve east. Mike closed his eyes and let the motion carry him forward because forward was the only direction left. The train returned Mike to Portland under a sky that seemed unwilling to decide whether it was day or night. It was a gray quilt pulled too low-stitched with threads of rain. He stepped off the platform carrying the same bag, the same weight, but something in his chest no longer sat exactly where it had before. When Emily saw him at the station, she didn't rush to hug him. She simply took his arm and nodded as if acknowledging a soldier home from a battle she would never fully understand. The drive back to Seaside passed in silence. The wipers beat their slow rhythm on the windshield while the ocean stayed hidden behind the dunes, its voice muted but insistent. When they pulled into the driveway, Mike caught sight of the house, its windows dark, its roof sagging a little more than he remembered. It looked like it had been holding its breath while he was gone. Inside, the kitchen table had been dressed for company. Emily had laid out finger sandwiches on plates that didn't match a bowl of strawberries still wet from rinsing, and a chocolate cake that leaned slightly to one side. It was not fancy, but it was ready. The smell of coffee mingled with the sharper scent of lemon cleaner, a sign of effort rather than decoration. "They'll be here at noon," Emily said, not looking at him as she straightened a napkin. Her voice was even, but her hands betrayed her nerves, folding and refolding the same square of cloth. "All three of them," Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. "All three," she confirmed. "And I told them. You might not be wearing your hat." The words hung in the air like a kite caught on a line, tugging but not breaking free. Mike's first instinct was to retreat to reach for the familiar shelter of fabric and shadow, but there was no room left for hiding. The surgeries had taken more than growths from his scalp. They had removed the illusion that concealment was safety. When the knock came, it was soft and rapid, the rhythm of children who don't know how to wait. Emily opened the door, and the house filled with voices, Lucas charging forward like a storm. Grace, more measured but no less eager, Ethan hovering in the doorway with his careful eyes. Their coats smelled of rain and playgrounds, their hair wind-tangled, their energy spilling over the threshold. Mike stood in the living room, rooted the cap still in his hand. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between his fingers and the fabric they clutched. Then Lucas spotted him and shouted "Grandpa" before launching himself across the room. Mike caught the boy automatically, his arms remembering what his mind could not plan, the small body pressed against his chest warm and real. Grace smiled shyly and joined the hug while Ethan lingered at the edge watching as if to make sure the scene was safe to enter. When the children stepped back, Grace tilted her head. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you're not wearing your hat." It was not an accusation, only an observation like noting that the tide was higher than yesterday. Mike swallowed. "Maybe I don't need it today," he said. His voice was steady, though his heart raced like a young man's engine. There was a beat of silence, and then Lucas grinned as if the whole thing had been decided by that one sentence. "Cool," he said, and ran off toward the kitchen, already distracted by the promise of cake. Lunch unfolded in a blur. Emily poured juice. The children argued cheerfully over who got the corner slice of cake, and Mike sat among them like a man newly translated into another language. Each laugh, each crumb on the tablecloth was a piece of a world he had nearly lost. He let himself be photographed when Emily's phone appeared, the flash catching the lines of his face without shame. When the plates were pushed aside and the room quieted into that gentle post-meal lull, Ethan approached. In his hands was something folded and colorful. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a crown made of construction paper, the kind children make with more hope than skill. The tape showed at the seams, the colors wobbled, but it held together. Grandpa Ethan said, his voice solemn in a way only children can manage. "Can you wear this?" Mike crouched so they were eye to eye. "I thought I was done wearing things on my head," he said, a smile tugging at his mouth. "This is different," Ethan replied, lifting the crown with both hands. "It's not to hide. It's because you're the king of the garden." The room seemed to hold its breath as Mike bowed his head. Ethan placed the crown gently, the paper rustling like dry leaves. In that moment, the weight Mike had carried for decades, the shame, the fear, the long silence shifted. It didn't vanish, but it moved somewhere else, somewhere smaller. Emily's eyes filled with tears, though she kept her hands busy clearing plates. Grace clapped softly. Lucas shouted, "All hail, King, Grandpa!" And, for the first time in a lifetime, Mike laughed without restraint. It was a laugh that belonged to the man Sarah had once loved, the man who had raced motorcycles and danced in the kitchen, the man who had been buried under years of fabric and hiding. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows, Emily took a photo Mike with his paper crown. The children clustered around him, the table messy with the evidence of a shared meal. It was a picture that required no explanation, no careful cropping. In the background, the ocean roared steady and ancient. Inside the house, a new kind of quiet settled, one made not of absence, but of peace. The next morning came quietly without ceremony. Seaside lay under a pale sky, the kind that made every roof and every tree seem outlined in silver. The ocean's voice was calm today, a steady exhale against the shore, as if the whole coastline were breathing in rhythm with the people who lived beside it. In Mike's bedroom, the dresser held one final act of letting go. The knit cap, once his shield in prison, sat folded in his hands. Its fabric had grown soft over decades of service, the brim stretched from endless adjustments. He turned it over slowly, fingers tracing the worn fibers. This cap had been his constant companion through fear and shame, through every retreat from the world. But today, it was no longer armor. It was history. Mike crossed the room to the bare wall near his wardrobe. With a simple hook and a steady motion, he hung the cap where it could be seen, but never again worn. It rested there, a quiet relic, no longer hiding anything, only telling the truth a life survived. Emily appeared in the doorway, her smile bright but not hurried. "Ready?" she asked softly. Mike nodded. "Yeah, let's go." Ethan waited outside with a paper kite clutched in both hands. It was simple, just sticks and string its tail, a patchwork of ribbon scraps. He had worked on it all week with a determination that reminded Mike of himself when he was young, back when building something with your own hands was a way to explain who you were without words. They walked together toward the edge of the park. The grass was still wet from last night's fog, glistening like small coins scattered by some generous tide. The wind tugged at their jackets, playful but persistent, the perfect accomplice for a kite that wanted to fly. Ethan looked up, his eyes bright. "Do you think it'll work?" Mike smiled down at him, the kind of smile that reached all the way back through time and stitched the past to the present. "Only one way to find out," he said. They positioned themselves in the clearing. Ethan held the kite high, while Mike gripped the string spool, their teamwork silent and sure. The first toss failed the kite, nosediving into the damp grass. Ethan frowned, ready to declare defeat, but Mike's voice was calm. Again, he said, "Sometimes you have to give the wind a second chance." On the next attempt, the breeze caught just right. The kite surged upward, the paper snapping as it found its wings. Ethan gasped, his hands flying to his mouth in delight. Together they let the string run more and more until the kite danced high above them, a bright scrap of hope stitched into the sky. Mike stood with his head bare to the air, the wind rushing past his scalp. It felt strange, almost raw, but alive, like learning to breathe after holding his breath for half a lifetime. He glanced down at Ethan, whose laughter rose into the wide-open day. In the boy's hair, brown and thick, he saw the possibility of what might come, but not the certainty of fear. If Ethan ever faced the same journey, he would not face it alone. There would be names now, and doctors who understood. There would be family who stayed, who didn't disappear behind doors and shadows. Mike would make sure of it. They reeled the kite back slowly, side by side, until it came to rest in their hands. Ethan turned to his grandfather and slipped his small hand into Mike's weathered one. No words were needed. That simple grip said everything love, trust, and a promise to keep going. Later, back at the house, Mike paused in the doorway. His eyes landed on the cap hanging on the wall. It seemed smaller now, just fabric and thread. He reached out not to take it down, but to honor it, then let his hand fall. From this day forward, he would walk without hiding. He stepped onto the porch and felt the wind kiss his head, unashamed and free. Behind him, Emily's laughter floated from the kitchen, mingling with the ocean's steady rhythm. As the sun began to set, painting the horizon in gold and violet, Mike understood something Sarah had once said to him in a different life, that healing wasn't about erasing scars, but about finding the courage to live with them in the light. For a long moment, he simply stood there breathing deeply, letting the salt air fill his lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, and the world felt wide enough for hope. If stories like Mike's remind you of your own battles, of the scars you hide and the victories you've earned, subscribe now. Your voice matters, and your journey can inspire others. Stay with us for more stories of resilience, healing, and the courage to be seen.